Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today with the Pharmaceutical Clinician Hub, bridging the gap between clinical medicine and the pharmaceutical industry. I'm very excited to have our guest speaker today, Jude Odafe. Now, Jude has a very interesting wealth of experience, starting off first in the medical space and then transitioning to the pharmaceutical industry. He's worked in the pharmaceutical industry now for well over a decade. He's currently based in Chicago with Amgen. And he's very passionate about integrating clinical practitioners, doctors, clinicians with members of the pharmaceutical industry. And this is absolutely perfect for what we're trying to do here with the Pharmaceutical Clinician Hub. So, Jude, an absolute pleasure to have you here today. I appreciate how busy you are. So, really excited to have you at this webinar. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for the introduction, Neil. Excited to be here today and
Great.
speak with you about this.
Yeah, no, definitely. So please do share everything with us today.
Yeah, so a little bit about myself. As Neil mentioned, I started off in the medical space where I was in medical school and I came to this big conclusion that I was much more interested in the products, the tools that were being used rather than being the person who was actually treating the patient. So I did the crazy thing and I dropped out of medical school, or withdrew is the formal term they like to use. And I went to go work for a startup where we did preclinical drug discovery using ion channels. So I was there for about a year and a half, and eventually the startup got acquired. And I went back to school, studied biotechnology. I started my career in the industry where I worked at Baxter International. I've worked in consulting for a little bit as well. And then I spent the majority of my time at a rare disease biotech called Horizon Therapeutics, which has now been acquired by Amgen back in 2023-ish. And I've been there since. Along the way, I had a stop in Cambridge to get my MBA as well. And that kind of leads me to where I am and where I've been at with in the biopharma, biotech space. And I've spent a lot of time working with different doctors to achieve a lot of different goals. And would like to share a little bit more about some of the ways we interact with physicians at varying levels, where it can be very, very low touch, very on and off and done, or it can be something where there's a relationship that builds over time. All
Fantastic.
right.
Very, very interesting. I do have an initial question, actually. Was there any sort of fear or anxiety when you were making that leap from medical school into more the biotech pharma space? Or were you just like, I'm very passionate about the product side, which clearly you can't do so much of in medical school, so on and so forth.
I would say there was a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, where I was in medical school for probably 6 weeks and I knew I wanted to leave, but I ended up staying for almost 18 months before I finally took the
Okay.
plunge. Um,
No,
you
it's
know,
great. It's great.
son of Nigerian immigrants, their goal is always to have their kid be lawyer, doctor, engineer. I chose the doctor path and then made them really happy when I dropped out. So a lot of anxiety about that, but it's all good,
No, that's fine.
years
That's
down the
absolutely
road.
fine. Yes, yes, definitely. Great.
Yeah. So, to get into it a little bit of how I look at these things, where we have different ways of interacting with the medical community, and I look at it kind of in varying levels, where there's a basic one of this is something where it's a phone call, a specific interaction about a specific topic, and that's it. There's no more to it. The second level, I would call that something where we're working on a specific project together. It's going to involve collaboration, there will be meetings, but again, this is something where it's contractual. You're not an employee of a pharmaceutical company or anything like that. And then the third level, this is something where you may be an employee, you may be an investigator who's leading a clinical trial. These are where it's a much deeper relationship that lasts over time. So I would like to start with the basic and then kind of go to the advanced. And with the basic, so this is where I look at one of my job or a couple of my job experiences. I was in a business development role. So think when I say business development, thinking more of transactions, so mergers and acquisitions in biopharma. And when we're doing those things, they're pretty highly scientific analyses where you want someone who's a PhD, an MD, frankly, if you have an MD, PhD, that's the perfect combination where we're trying to talk to them both about the mechanism of how diseases work or the mechanism of how a molecule works. And then at the same time, getting that clinical perspective of if you're making this type of a change where you're moving up or down some scale, what does that mean in real life to a patient, to a doctor? So these types of engagements, this is where we're having a simple conversation. I usually would structure a questionnaire where I'm asking them about the disease state in general, asking them about their patient volume so I understand who they're treating, what type of patients they see. And then from there, digging into it, what's their standard of care? What does this look like to diagnose a patient? Where do they come from? How do you treat them? When do you decide to use medication versus other things? And what does it look like after your kind of interaction with the patient is over? At the same time, we also want to think about what's coming in the future. So these are things where we're looking at usually specific acquisition targets, whether they could be preclinical, they could be in phase one, phase two, phase three of clinical trials. And we want to get a sense of what do you think about this compared to your current options, or if there are no options, what do you think about it as far as on different scales of impact it could potentially have? So we'll ask them, to help us understand, rate it against competitor products or competitor pipeline molecules if they're available. And then also if they're unavailable, just looking at holistically, what type of change do you think could come from something like this in your patient care? So that gives us an idea from a physician's perspective of I have this new tool in my toolbox and what could I do with it? What would be the limitations? What would be the advantages? And we both go into it knowing that this is all very it's at a to put it bluntly, it's guesswork because it's not real, but it's theoretical, and we want to talk to the people who are most qualified to have those conversations. And that's where physicians come into play. Now, these conversations, a lot of times they're usually conducted double blind. So we won't know who you are. We'll have a profile that describes, your background, your experience, your specialty, and so forth. And we will screen through the different candidates and choose the ones that look most relevant, where, you get a mix, some key opinion leaders at a, you know, local, national, international level. And you also want people who are treaters who are seeing, a good amount of these patients on the regular basis versus someone who may be devoting the majority of their time to research. So you want a mix of both of those opinions. And from your perspective, you hear that, hey, somebody wants to learn about this area, and you'll just have an unfiltered conversation. You can speak freely. We make sure there's no identifying information given. Um, and it's really just to help us understand things. And so the double blind piece, it protects both sides, where again, you can speak freely, no one knows who it is. And then a lot of times these things, they're publicly traded companies. No one will get jammed up with insider information or anything like that. So it's like a nice, easy, quick way to have an interaction with the pharmaceutical company where it's a fact-finding mission. It's really about how do you handle these situations? What excites you in the future? What are your challenges now? How can those be fixed? That's the simplest, easiest, kind of cleanest interaction that you have with physicians. And that's something that you do all the time when you're looking at those business development or M&A activities. So I'll pause there. Any questions about that?
No, I think you gave a really interesting overview, and actually, I guess it kind of overcomes any potential negative perception or biases, because often I think clinicians can view the pharmaceutical industry in a negative light, but what you're actually describing is that it's a partnership. So it's always initially about developing that relationship and, like you say, fact finding, just trying to understand the patient population, understand it from the physician experts, and then see if there's any gaps currently in the treatment space. Yeah, no, you described it fantastically.
Right. Thank you. And just to like put a little more color to it, where you think about depending on the focus of the company, I've spent a lot of time in rare disease, and those are things that, you know, even me who has a scientific background, it's not like I'm going to know off the top of my head what it takes to diagnose these patients or manage them, all those challenges. That's where these conversations are crucial, where you're having, I don't know, 5 to 10 of these. And that's something where it just helps us directionally understand, you know, what things are like. And then from there, you can do other formal things that are going to dive into a bit more detail. But that's kind of the key piece with these initial conversations. And again, as I mentioned, they're double blinded, quick and easy. There are lots of vendors that do this, in the US. We use what is it, Guide Point. I think there are a few like Dialectica or something. There are a lot of different vendors that do this, and that's kind of where we source these calls at for these very basic ones. Um, so that's the first kind of way that we interact. The second one I'll get into is where we have specific engagements. And so again, this is something that it's a contractual basis. And now, I'm in a role where I'm doing marketing. And when you think of marketing, I don't know, for me, I used to think of marketing as whatever, TV commercials, um, pamphlets that end up in doctors' offices and things like that. And that's not at all what I'm interested in or what I do. For me, it's much more about physician to physician or HCP to HCP engagement. So I work with different HCPs to develop some content, to develop materials that can either be done at a speaker program, it could be presented at a congress, so it's all peer-to-peer interactions that I am focused on of doctors talk to doctors because who do you want to hear from? You want to hear from other physicians, other HCPs, not from some marketing guy. Um, so these ones again, they are very much it's a contractual thing where everyone has a goal of what we're trying to do. For us, like I said, I work in rare disease. A lot of times the biggest challenge is helping people understand what the disease even looks like. These are things that they're often mistaken for much larger indications or something that's traditionally been treated one way or another. And we're helping to educate that, hey, this patient might look like X, but they're actually Y. And I'll give an example. There's a disease called neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder. It looks very similar to multiple sclerosis, and for many, many years, it was recognized, diagnosed, and treated as multiple sclerosis. I think they would call it treatment-resistant MS at times, depending on where you were geographically. And so they realized eventually, some very smart people figured out that this is actually a separate mechanism, a separate disease. It just presents very, very similarly. And so with that, the biggest task for us was to make sure that everyone understands that, hey, this segment of patients that previously you gave them all these medications and nothing seemed to work, they might actually have a completely different disease, and this is through nobody's fault because it wasn't identified, it wasn't known yet. Um, that's a big way that we work on these interactions where I'm thinking about disease state education. So I will work with the physician, particularly a lot of times we'll work with a big academic medical center, and we'll set out to define the disease, everything from just what it presents like to the pathophysiology to differential diagnosis to treatment options at a high level, where we're talking more about mechanism of treatment rather than like specific brands, because this is disease state education. It's not designed to promote one product versus another. And so with those, that's where we kind of have an ongoing conversation for a little while where we'll sit with them, understand, what are the key things that people need to understand and know about this? How can we better elucidate those materials for people to get it in a 30-minute presentation, whatever it may be. And then from there, we will work with our creative teams, come up with the materials, and again, work with the HCPs to refine it so that we have something that's nice, it's tight, it speaks to clinicians where I may think about something in one way because I've done engineering, but it may not be the way that in medical school things are presented in a case. So we try and tweak those things. Again, that's where this physician input comes into play to kind of structure the material that speaks to or will appeal to the background of those who are actually utilizing this material. So it's a really, really powerful tool where we have a contract of, just to like give you an example of the nitty gritty of it, of let's say we contract an HCP for 10 hours where they're going to review the materials we've made, have some calls with us, tell us where we're missing things, what we should include, what we shouldn't include, and then we go forth and do essentially from there. So again, it's something where it's kind of like it's a cut and dry thing, it's contractual. You're not an employee of the company or anything like that. We are engaging you for your medical expertise because I'm not a doctor, you know, and neither are the majority of my teammates. So I think that's where we have a great interaction that allows us to interact with different KOLs for different diseases. And it, again, we think about this where a lot of companies, you're not just going to operate in one geography. You want to make sure that here's what we've learned in the US, but we need to tweak things because it presents a little bit differently for the German population. And their healthcare system is a little bit different as well. So understanding what that diagnosis process looks like, it may not be the same. You're not going to order the same test um, if you're in one country versus another. So again, these are the different types of nuances that we get to understand through these interactions.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, I think, if clinicians are keen on the pharmaceutical arena, to be involved in that education setting is really quite unique because without the right information and without people actually understanding the information, I don't think you can make much progress, right? So I think a lot of it probably is about, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's about putting the information out there, but making sure that it's simple, easy to absorb and process. Um, Apart from the
Exactly.
healthcare providers, is there any other group that you sort of um, rely on to help with the sort of marketing side? So patients, I assume, also may have some role.
So it depends on what you're doing. So for me, I don't involve patients much just because my goal is with the HCPs and my focus is that, but we definitely have teams where their whole aim is to create patient education. So again, we will work with physicians on that and we'll work with patients on it as well to make sure that, you know, we're not going to go into the disease mechanism and talk about B cells and CD19 versus CD20 at a patient presentation. But for you as a clinician, that may be relevant. Um, but again, yeah, we
Mm.
definitely want to make sure it's tailored to the right level for different audiences. And patients are crucial as well as physicians. And we do work with what I'll call APPs, advanced practice providers, to kind of encompass that whole bubble of physician assistants, nurse practitioners, kind of the other caretakers that they're not necessarily a doctor, but they are crucial to patient care. And you have to make sure that they're also not an ignored population as well. So we do engage with them in this same fashion also.
Yeah, that's very
Yeah.
helpful. Yeah, definitely. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And to provide a little bit of balance, we do the same thing where it's not just disease state education. We do the same thing when it is branded. So if you're developing materials for your product that you want to show why it's differentiated versus the competition that's out there, again, we will speak with a lot of physicians to understand their experience, to understand what's good, what's bad. And it's something where you're never setting out to bash a competitor. You're always setting out to make sure that you're highlighting your benefits, what's your differentiator, whether that is maybe your efficacy is the highest, or maybe your product is the most convenient, where you have twice yearly dosing, or you're only getting dosed once a month or twice a month. Those getting those type of insights of what really matters, or if you have very strong safety, you know, very few products are perfect. Some of them, the science is so good, the product will sell itself, but that is few and far between. And so for the rest of them, we're making sure that we're understanding what actually appeals to physicians in a positive way, um, versus trying to bash others or trying to downplay other options. It's really about here's highlighting what we do well and why that is important for this your patients, or maybe just a sub segment of patients. Not your product may not be for everybody, and that's okay. And that's what we learned from doctors as well, where we may think that, hey, this is the perfect solution for all your patients, and they're like, no, I would only use this in people who have this scenario and this type of background, and it's best suited for them because that's where I see the efficacy, or that's where I see the actual ability to stay persistent and on medication or adherent to medication. So it works for both disease state education and for some of the branded efforts that we make as well. And it's up
And
to you as a physician to choose where you want to engage. I have
mm,
doctors that I work with where some of them will only do disease state materials and they don't want anything to do with a specific medication. And that could be their preference, it could be an
mm,
institutional requirement.
mm.
And then I have some doctors that like to do both. And it's really just depends on your preference.
No, definitely, and I think you raise a very valuable point that the feedback that you get once therapy is out there, and the way the physician is able to tell you, okay, it works in this particular situation or scenario, and actually, even though maybe the disease state is the same, there's certain sort of caveats where it doesn't work. So I think that that's actually very valuable information to gain as well. So continuing that partnership between the physician and the pharmaceutical industry, certainly, yeah.
Yep. And so just to kind of sum up this last piece, those engagements, it's going to depend on it's going to depend on what you're trying to do, where the amount of time that you're scheduled to do this. I did give the example of like saying, hey, we have 10 hours to review this. It's something where it could be 10 hours. It's something where you could be working on something for maybe a couple months with somebody. It all just depends on how big or small the project is over time. Um, and then when I start to move to this next level of kind of the interaction, this is where you have something that is kind of ongoing. And there's different ways to do this, where if you think about it from an R&D perspective, there are people who are investigators in clinical trials. There are people who are working on different publications based off of clinical trials and real world evidence. These are the type of things that they're a little bit more extended. You're going to have to do things over a period of years. I myself, I'm not too involved in those, so I'm not going to speak in detail about those, but I'll talk a little bit about one where I do have like a contractual relationship with between a company and a physician that it goes over a period of like a year or 2 years or something. So we do, as I mentioned, kind of this education piece where we're doing disease state or branded education. And I mentioned that, who do doctors want to hear from? They want to hear from other doctors. So we have a group of doctors that we work with, and they will do presentations at different venues off of these materials that have been approved through legal, medical, and regulatory review. So it's sliced and diced by the authority of whatever country you're in, by lawyers, and then by medical experts as well before anybody presents it. And so with this, we kind of do smaller group programs where we'll have a doctor who will go and give a presentation to other doctors. And it could be about either the branded materials or it could be about the unbranded materials that we've developed through one of these previous engagements I mentioned. And so this is something that they can do throughout a year. They can do, 2 to 5 of these, let's say, on example. So that's where you kind of have an extended relationship, um, where you're under contract with a company and it's not for 10 hours, it's for a year or something, and it enables you to deliver these presentations. Um, that's one where I said it's like that next level of relationship. Um, Another thing that we do is literature reviews. So when new articles that are relevant come out, we'll try and create something from it where we want to make sure that people are reading this information. And a lot of times we'll engage directly with the author and work with them to do something that I could call it a literature review. Some people call it a journal club. Don't quote me on it. Different names, different places. And really, it's a roundtable discussion where we want to have doctors or HCPs discussing the latest article that has come out and learning about it. So we work with the author to come up with a discussion guide, questions that we would like to have answered. Where, what do you think about the way this study was conducted? How does this impact your clinical practice? Um, what general takeaways do you have from this? What's lacking? What's missing? What would we like to see next? Those type of things. And that's where, again, you're putting together something where it's not a presentation. It is a discussion guide. The materials for the events, it's the actual paper that we're discussing, and that's what the attendees have. And then the doctor who is the leader of it, or the moderator, has a discussion guide and will go through to have a discussion with the HCPs. And so I think those are something that are some of my favorite programs. They're very, very effective. And I think because it comes from a place of, here's what is relevant for the HCP community right now, not just, we've pushed this because we have some branded thing that we want to get out there, but it's like, this was written by one of your key opinion leaders. Let's learn from it. What do we think about it? And how does that translate into what we're doing? So that's, again, one of those things where, as a physician, you can attend these programs, you can be the moderator in these programs. The moderator is someone who will, again, be under a contract. So again, that's kind of like that third level I mentioned. But overall, it's a great way to interact with the pharmaceutical industry, and you can do it from either side. So I hope these kind of examples give a little bit of insight where you
Yeah.
can be someone who's doing clinical trials, you can be someone who's doing commercial programs, you can be someone who's doing disease state programs. You can also just be an attendee at some of these programs if you want to learn more. And then a lot of the double blinded things down to that very basic level where it's a phone call for an hour, and you don't know who you're talking to, they don't know who they're talking to, but they do know that you're qualified and have great insights.
No, thanks so much. I mean, this was really nice sort of journey from your perspective about how the physician can interact in sort of the pharmaceutical arena. And I think, you summed up very nicely at least three or four examples. So the initial one that you mentioned is, the initial exploration about disease states and trying to understand more information from the physician who, treats the patient. And then moving on to being involved in designing the educational material, getting the word out there, promoting the information around the new therapy, and making sure that people understand it and are aware about it. And then all the way to, I guess, the expert arena and consensus meetings to hear from the key opinion leaders that have that expertise with the drug, and then allow other physicians to be part of those meetings and present at these meetings, and contribute also to the research side. So I think a lot of opportunities there for physicians, and that interaction is very crucial. So thanks so much, Jude. It's been an absolute pleasure. I know again how busy you are at Amgen, and I'm sure you're very passionate about what you do. So certainly everyone out there, reach out to Jude. He's on LinkedIn, so he's more than happy to be contacted with any further questions and advice. And thanks once again. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Jude.
Thanks, Neil. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.